Hey everyone, welcome back for another deep dive with us.
Glad to be here.
Today we're tackling a topic that might seem a little morbid, but it's actually super relevant if you're, at all interested in building a successful company. Failure.
Yeah, failure. It's not exactly a fun topic to dwell on,
Right.
but like you said, it's something you really can't avoid if you're in the startup world.
Especially in the startup world.
Yeah, exactly.
And to help us kind of dissect this whole thing, we're diving into a book with a very catchy title. Kim Hvidkjaer's How to Fuck Up Your Startup.
Oh, yeah, I've heard of this one.
Yeah, have you read it?
Yeah.
I have.
What'd you think?
I thought it was really interesting. He's got this kind of blunt in your face style, but there's so much truth to what he's saying. And I think it's refreshing to have someone just lay it all out there like that.
It's very refreshing, right?
Yeah.
So why don't we start with Hvidkjaer's story?
Yeah. Because that kind of sets the stage for why we should listen to him in the first place.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
he went from being a millionaire to broke in just 2 years.
Oh, yeah. His story is pretty wild, right? Like, talk about a roller coaster ride. But I think that's part of what makes his insights so valuable. He's been through the trenches. He's made the mistakes.
He's been there.
So he knows what he's talking about.
Exactly. So
Yeah.
let's jump right in. What's the first big mistake that people make when they're starting a company?
Well, he actually starts with attitude, which I thought was interesting.
Okay, attitude.
Yeah, like before you even get to the business plan or the product or anything like that, he talks about the importance of having the right mindset.
Okay, I can see that.
Like, are you truly obsessed with this idea? Are you willing to put in the long hours and the hard work? Because starting a company is not for the faint of heart.
Definitely not a 9 to 5.
No, not at all. And he's got this kind of funny way of putting it. He calls it the toilet test.
The toilet test. Okay.
Oh.
I'm intrigued.
Yeah. So basically he says, if your startup idea doesn't come to mind at least once a day, even when you're on the toilet,
Okay.
it's probably not a strong enough foundation for a company.
So you need to be truly obsessed with it.
Yeah.
It needs to be consuming your every thought.
Yeah, pretty much. You got to be thinking about it all the time.
Okay, that makes sense. But what about imposter syndrome? Because I feel like that's something that a lot of entrepreneurs struggle with, especially in the beginning. You're like, who am I to do this?
Oh, yeah, for sure. Imposter syndrome is a real thing, and it can be really crippling if you let it.
Absolutely.
But Hvidkjaer acknowledges that, most founders experience it,
Okay.
but instead of letting it paralyze you, he encourages you to reframe it.
Okay.
He says even the most successful people have doubts, but they act despite them.
So it's about taking action even when you're feeling unsure.
Exactly. Don't wait for the fear to go away. Just move forward anyway.
I like that. Action over perfection.
Yeah.
So we've talked about attitude. What's the next big mistake that Hvidkjaer highlights?
Well, he dives into business models.
Business model.
And he uses this really interesting example of a company called News Tilt. They were trying to help journalists sell their work online. They even got into Y Combinator, which is like a huge accelerator program, but they failed in just 2 months.
2 months. Wow.
Yeah, it was a really fast flame out.
So what went wrong there?
Well, a few things, actually. He talks about how they treated it like a 9-to-5 job instead of a passionate mission.
Okay.
They also lacked a strong shared vision for the company, and their business model itself wasn't robust enough to sustain them.
So it wasn't just one thing. It was kind of a combination of factors.
Yeah, exactly. It was kind of death by 1,000 cuts.
So you can have a great idea, but if you don't have the right structure in place and the right team and the right mindset, it's not going to work.
Right. It's like having all the ingredients for a cake, but not knowing how to bake it.
Yeah, that's a perfect analogy.
Yeah.
So what does Hvidkjaer recommend when it comes to building a solid business model?
Well, he gives a very specific step-by-step process, which I really appreciate. Because I think a lot of times people talk about business plans in this very vague way.
Right.
But he breaks it down into manageable chunks. He says you should start with a business model canvas, which only takes 15 to 30 minutes to create.
Okay, that's manageable.
Yeah. And then from there, you can build it out to a one-page plan, a budget, a project plan, and eventually a full business plan. But he stresses that you don't need to do it all at once.
You don't need to get bogged down in the details right away.
Right. Start small and iterate.
Start small and iterate.
I like that.
Okay, so we've got our attitude in check. We've got a solid business plan. What else should we be watching out for?
He talks about what he calls the idiot industry concept.
The idiot industry.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm curious.
So basically, he says that some industries are just notoriously difficult to make profitable, no matter how good you are.
Okay.
He uses florists and restaurants as examples. It's interesting. Like, you could be the best florist in the world, but the margins are just tough in that business.
There's only so much you can charge for a bouquet of flowers.
Exactly. And restaurants have such high overhead costs
Yeah.
that it can be really hard to make a sustainable profit.
So how can you avoid falling into that trap? Like, how do you know if you're in an idiot industry?
He recommends using tools like Porter's 5 Forces to analyze an industry's attractiveness.
Porter's 5 Forces.
Yeah.
I've heard of that.
It's a framework for understanding the competitive landscape and the potential for profitability.
Okay.
So before you even start a company,
Yeah.
he says you should do your research and make sure that you're not entering a market that's already saturated or where the economics just don't make sense.
Do your homework before you go all in.
Exactly.
Okay, that makes sense. So we've talked about attitude, business models, the idiot industry concept.
Yeah.
What about the actual idea itself? Like, what are some common mistakes people make when they're coming up with their startup idea?
That's a great question. And it's something that Hvidkjaer dives into in quite a bit of detail. One of the things he talks about is what he calls problemless solutions.
Problemless solutions.
Yeah.
I think I know what you mean. Like those fancy gadgets that solve problems nobody actually has.
Exactly. Like those Wi-Fi enabled toasters that tell you the weather.
Yeah, exactly. Or like a refrigerator that orders groceries for you.
Right. And
Yeah.
he uses this example of T-Foria, which was a $1,000 Wi-Fi tea infuser.
$1,000 tea infuser. Who's buying that?
I know, right? It's a prime example of a solution looking for a problem.
It's like they came up with the technology first
Mm-hmm.
and then tried to figure out a problem to solve with it.
Yeah, I think that happens a lot.
So what's the takeaway here?
I think the takeaway is to focus on solving real problems that people are actually struggling with, not just coming up with a cool tech solution for the sake of it.
Don't be a solution looking for a problem.
Exactly.
Find a problem and then build a solution around that.
Right.
Make sure there's a need for what you're creating.
Yeah, because if nobody wants it, it doesn't matter how cool it is.
That's going to sell.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
And, even when you do have a good problem to solve, there are still ways to mess it up.
Oh, I bet.
Market research is huge. Like you said, everyone's always saying validate your idea,
Right.
but people do it wrong all the time.
Like how?
Well, one mistake Hvidkjaer calls doppelganger danger.
Doppelganger danger.
Basically, don't just copy what's already out there.
Okay.
There were tons of Pinterest clones that totally flopped, and even Facebook tried to get in on the photo sharing game with their hobby app, but it died quickly because, well, Pinterest was already crushing it.
Wow. So even a giant like Facebook can fall into that trap.
Yeah, it's not just about having a good idea, it's about timing, too.
And market fit?
Exactly.
So what's the opposite of that?
Being unnecessarily original. And that can be just as bad.
How so?
If nobody else is doing what you're doing, there might be a reason.
Oh, right.
Nobody needed an app to judge people's age from a photo.
Yeah, I remember that one. Nobody was asking for that.
Nope.
So it's like striking that balance between being innovative, but also meeting a real market need.
Absolutely.
Don't be too weird.
And don't forget about network effects.
Network effects.
Think Facebook, LinkedIn.
Okay.
Those platforms are valuable because so many people use them.
Right.
It's almost impossible to compete with that kind of network.
So starting a new social network today, that's a tough one.
Extremely tough. And then there's the obvious one, customers.
Customers.
So many startups build stuff nobody wants.
You're kidding.
It's true.
Any examples?
EventView.
What was that?
It was a social network for conferences.
Oh, okay.
So you could connect with people before the event.
Right.
Not a terrible idea.
Well,
It wasn't solving a burning need.
it was more of a nice to have.
Exactly.
Not a must have.
Nope.
So we've got our attitude in check, solid business model. We're solving a real problem that people actually care about. What about the actual product itself?
Product development. This is where things get really interesting.
Okay.
Because even if you have funding, you can still screw this up.
Oh, I'm sure.
Hvidkjaer talks about FNAC.
FNAC.
It stands for features no one actually cares about.
I love that. FNAC.
Right.
Yeah.
It's so true. Investors hate this. They don't want to see you wasting resources on things that don't matter.
Of course not.
He gives the example of Rivet and Sway. They made eyeglasses, and they raised $2 million.
Okay.
But they failed because they over-outsourced their production, which made it way too expensive to acquire customers.
So even with money in the bank, It
Yeah,
can still mess it up.
absolutely.
What else should we be avoiding when it comes to product development?
Big bang releases.
What's that?
When you try to launch a ton of new features all at once,
Oh, yeah, I've seen that backfire.
it can be super overwhelming for users. And if something goes wrong, it impacts everything.
Exactly.
He uses Moz as an example. They're a big SEO company. And they tried this big bang approach, and it flopped hard. It actually hurt their business.
So what's the alternative?
Growth hacking.
Growth hacking.
Yeah. It's basically about making small, frequent releases
Yeah.
and constantly testing to see what works.
So instead of betting everything on one massive launch, you're iterating and adapting as you go.
Exactly.
More agile.
Much more agile.
Okay, I like that. Any other product pitfalls we should be aware of?
One of my favorites is what he calls the mashup.
The mashup.
It's when you try to slap technology onto something that doesn't really need it.
Oh, yeah. Like those internet-connected refrigerators that cost like $1,000.
Exactly. He uses Juicero as the prime example.
Juicero, oh, yeah.
Yeah.
That ridiculously expensive Wi-Fi juicer.
It was basically a glorified squeezer with a monthly subscription.
And it failed miserably.
Well,
So the lesson here is, don't over-engineer things.
right.
Technology should enhance a product, not just be tacked on for the sake of looking cool.
Exactly.
Sometimes the simplest solution is the best.
Absolutely.
Okay, so we've talked about attitude,
Right.
business models, market research, product development. What about the funding side of things? Because I feel like that's a big hurdle for a lot of startups.
It is a big hurdle. And Hvidkjaer doesn't sugarcoat it.
Okay.
He points out that securing funding can be a real challenge.
Oh, I'm sure.
And there are a lot of ways to mess it up.
Like what?
Well, for starters, just getting funded at all can be a huge time suck.
Okay.
It takes you away from focusing on building your product.
So it's kind of a catch-22.
It can be. You need funding to survive, but you can't let the pursuit of funding derail your entire operation.
Right.
And he warns against getting funded too early.
Too early?
Yeah.
How can you be funded too early?
He talks about Pearl Automation. They made a high-tech rear-view camera, and they got $50 million in funding.
Wow.
But nobody seemed to care about whether people actually wanted the product.
So they had all this money, but no customers.
Pretty much. They basically burned through their funding trying to please investors instead of validating their idea with customers.
Ouch. That's a tough lesson to learn.
It is.
So what's the alternative?
Bootstrapping.
Bootstrapping, funding the company yourself.
Exactly. Hvidkjaer is a big advocate for bootstrapping and self-funding in the early stages.
Oh.
He argues that it forces you to be more resourceful, more focused, and truly committed to your product.
Because you have to make every dollar count.
Exactly. And if you can build traction without outside investment, it shows that you're really on something.
It's a good sign.
It is.
But what about once you do start taking on investment?
Well, then he talks about the importance of understanding your cap table.
Cap table.
Yeah, it's basically a document that outlines who owns what percentage of your company.
Okay.
And he stresses the importance of having clear agreements with investors and being prepared for dilution as you take on more funding.
Dilution?
Yeah. It means that your ownership stake in the company will decrease as you issue more shares to investors.
Okay.
It's not necessarily a bad thing, but you need to understand how it works and make sure you're comfortable with the terms.
So get your legal ducks in a row early on.
Exactly.
Okay, what about the less glamorous stuff, like accounting?
Accounting.
Yeah, nobody likes to think about that.
I know, but Hvidkjaer is adamant about this one.
Okay.
He says you need to hire a professional accountant or bookkeeper, even in the early stages.
Really?
Yeah,
Even if you're bootstrapping?
especially if you're bootstrapping.
Why is that?
Because even small mistakes can have big consequences.
Okay.
He tells this crazy story about Scale Factor, which was an accounting software company
Okay.
that ironically made a ton of accounting errors,
Oh, wow.
costing their clients thousands of dollars.
That's ironic.
It is. The point is, even if you hate accounting, you can't afford to mess it up.
Right.
A good accountant can save you time, money, and a lot of headaches down the road.
So it's worth the investment.
Absolutely.
Speaking of potential headaches, what about the people side of things? Building a team and all that?
Ah, yes, the team.
Yeah.
Hvidkjaer dedicates a whole chapter to organizational fuck-ups.
Organizational fecka.
Yeah.
Okay.
He actually shares a personal anecdote about getting arrested
Arrested.
because of his business partner's poor administrative skills.
Wait, what?
Apparently, his business partner hadn't properly closed down a previous company, and there were some unpaid taxes.
Oh.
It turned out to be a bureaucratic mistake, and he was quickly cleared. But it highlights the importance of choosing your partners wisely.
Yeah. A weak link in the founding team can really sabotage your efforts.
Absolutely.
So what else does he talk about when it comes to building a team?
Well, he talks about the importance of having complementary skill sets.
Okay.
He uses the example of Steve Blank,
But
who was a CEO who lost $35 million
$35 million.
because his team had zero experience in the gaming industry.
Oh, wow.
So it's not just about being best buddies.
Right.
It's about having the right expertise and experience to tackle the challenges ahead. It's like assembling a superhero team.
Each with their own unique powers.
Exactly.
So you've got to find people who complement each other's strengths and weaknesses.
Exactly. And he cautions against rushing into partnerships, especially with friends and family.
Oh, yeah, that can be tricky.
It can. He really emphasizes vetting potential co-founders thoroughly and having clear agreements in place from the start.
So it's like dating before marriage.
Yeah, kind of.
You need to get to know each other well
Yeah,
and make sure you're truly compatible
exactly.
before you make that commitment.
Right.
Okay, so you've assembled your dream team. What are some common mistakes people make once they've got their team in place?
He talks about the dangers of hiring freezes.
Hiring freezes?
Yeah.
You mean like not hiring anyone?
Exactly.
I thought that was a good thing.
Well, he argues that not hiring the right people at the right time can be just as detrimental as hiring too quickly.
So it's about finding that balance
It is.
between strategic growth and assembling the right team to support it.
Exactly.
But how do you make sure you're hiring the right people in the first place?
He offers some practical advice for that.
Okay.
He talks about clearly defining the role you're hiring for, looking beyond just skills and experience to assess cultural fit,
Right.
and always having multiple interviews.
That makes sense.
He even tells this funny story about a founder who accidentally made a candidate think they were hired by giving them an employment contract to review.
Oh, no.
Yeah, it was a bit of a mess.
I bet.
It highlights the importance of clear communication and a structured hiring process.
So don't get ahead of yourself.
Right?
Okay, so you've hired your dream team, but what happens when things aren't working out? What about firing people?
Ah, yes, the dreaded F word.
It's a tough topic.
It is, but it's a reality of running a business.
So how do you do it well?
Hvidkjaer acknowledges that it's never easy, but he offers some advice on how to do it effectively and compassionately.
Okay.
He emphasizes being direct and honest with the person,
Okay.
clearly explaining the reasons for their termination,
Right.
and, if possible, offering positive feedback and support.
So even in tough situations, it's important to treat people with respect.
Absolutely, and he has this rule: never fire someone who hasn't seen it coming.
Oh, that's a good one.
He believes in giving warnings and opportunities for improvement. Before resorting to termination,
That's fair.
it gives people a chance to course correct.
And hopefully avoid that outcome altogether.
Exactly.
So once you've got your team in place, what's the next big hurdle?
It's all about growth.
Yeah.
Once you've got the team in place, that's when the real fun begins.
Growth. Yeah. But I imagine that comes with its own set of challenges.
Well, absolutely. It can feel like you're trying to tame a wild beast sometime.
Right. Exciting, but also potentially dangerous.
Exactly. And Hvidkjaer actually starts this section by emphasizing the importance of mindset during the growth phase.
Mindset. Okay.
Yeah, he talks about the need for self-awareness and introspection.
So taking a step back and really looking at yourself as a leader.
Exactly. Are you truly equipped to handle the challenges of growth?
Because it's not just about pushing for growth at all costs.
Right. It's about being mindful and strategic about how you grow.
So what are some of the common growth feck-ups that people make?
Well, one is poor pivoting.
Pivoting. Yeah, we talked about that earlier.
Right. It's when a company decides to change direction.
Like Yelp with their email recommendation system.
Exactly. And while pivoting can be successful,
It has to be done strategically,
absolutely, it needs to be a deliberate decision based on data and market feedback.
not a knee-jerk reaction to early struggles.
Right. You can't just abandon ship at the first sign of trouble.
So what else should we be watching out for?
He talks about getting distracted by what he calls wrong work.
Wrong work. What's that?
It's basically when founders get bogged down in tasks that aren't truly essential to the company's growth.
So it's about prioritizing,
Exactly. Focus on what moves the needle for your business.
delegate, or outsource the rest.
Right. And this might seem obvious, but he dedicates a whole section to the importance of making good decisions.
Decision-making. Yeah, that's crucial in a startup.
It is. There's so much pressure to make the right call.
And the consequences can feel really high.
They can be, and Hvidkjaer talks about how things like cognitive biases can really influence our decision-making.
Even if we're not aware of it.
Exactly, like loss aversion can make us avoid taking risks.
even when they might be beneficial in the long run.
Right, so it's about being aware of those biases,
And trying to make decisions based on logic and data.
not just fear or emotion.
Makes sense.
And he also warns against overcomplicating things, especially as the company grows.
Keep it simple, stupid.
Exactly, Kit.
So how can startups avoid getting bogged down in complexity?
He uses the example of Supercell, which is a really successful gaming company.
Yep.
Early on, they wasted a lot of time building complex management structures before realizing that a simpler, flatter approach was more effective.
So it's about focusing on the core activities that drive growth.
And avoiding unnecessary layers of bureaucracy.
Got it. So we've talked about avoiding wrong work and overcomplicating things. What else should we be watching out for?
This might surprise you, but he talks about the dangers of growing too fast.
Growing too fast. Isn't that what everyone's striving for?
It is, but Hvidkjaer argues that uncontrolled growth can be just as detrimental as no growth at all.
Okay.
He uses Zynga as an example.
The company behind Farmville.
Right, they had explosive growth, but they weren't able to scale their operations and infrastructure fast enough to support it.
So it's about managing growth sustainably.
Exactly, making sure that your systems and processes can keep up with the increasing demand.
Like building a house on a weak foundation.
Exactly, you need a strong base to support the rest of the structure.
And what about the opposite of that? What about giving up too soon?
Ah, yes, perseverance is key.
Especially in the startup world.
Absolutely, and Hvidkjaer shares the story of Rovio.
The company behind Angry Birds.
Right, you know how many games they released before they hit it big with Angry Birds?
I have no idea. But I'm guessing it wasn't just one or two.
It was 51 games.
51 games.
51 games, they kept iterating, experimenting, and refining their approach.
Until they found that winning formula.
Exactly.
Wow, that's incredible.
It shows the power of persistence.
And the importance of learning from your mistakes.
Absolutely, but there's a balance to that, right?
Oh, right. You can't just keep pushing forward blindly.
Exactly. He also talks about the importance of knowing when to quit.
When to call it quits.
Yeah, when to admit that a project has run its course.
And move on to something new.
Right, it can be a tough call.
Especially if you've poured your heart and soul into something.
But sometimes it's the best decision.
For both the company and the founder.
Absolutely, it frees you up for new opportunities.
So it's about being honest with yourself.
And recognizing when it's time to move on.
That's a valuable lesson.
It is, and in the final chapter of the book, Kim Hvidkjaer tackles a topic that's both fascinating and a bit daunting.
Oh, what's that?
Predicting the future.
Predicting the future. How can you possibly do that?
Well, he emphasizes the importance of being realistic.
Not just blindly optimistic.
Right, you can't just base your decisions on wishful thinking.
You need data market trends and a healthy dose of realism.
Exactly, and he suggests a few frameworks that can be helpful for thinking about the future.
Okay, like what?
One is the Johari window.
The Johari window. What's that?
It's a tool that helps you understand different types of knowledge.
Okay.
The things you know,
Ew.
the things you know you don't know, the things you don't know you know, and the things you don't know you don't know.
Wow, that's a lot of unknowns.
It is, but it's about recognizing the limits of your knowledge.
And being prepared for surprises.
Exactly. It helps you think about your blind spots.
And encourages you to seek out information and perspectives beyond your own.
Right, and he also talks about the PESTLE framework.
PESTLE.
It stands for political, economic, social, technological, legal, and environmental.
Okay.
So it encourages you to think about all of these factors and how they might impact your business in the future.
So it's a holistic view of the forces that could shape the future of your company.
Exactly. And ultimately, he emphasizes the importance of maximizing your future freedom of action.
Freedom of action.
Being flexible and adaptable so you can navigate the uncertainties that lie ahead.
So even with all this planning and preparation, is failure still a possibility?
Hvidkjaer is very upfront about this. He says, even if you do everything right, failure is still a possibility.
So there are no guarantees.
There are no guarantees, but, and this is the important part, he emphasizes that failure is not the end of the world.
Yeah.
In fact, it can be a valuable learning experience.
That sets you up for future success.
Exactly. It's about embracing failure as part of the journey.
Using it as fuel for growth and innovation.
Right. It's not about avoiding failure at all costs.
It's about learning from it and coming back stronger.
Exactly. He reminds us that even Microsoft, one of the most successful companies in the world,
Okay.
was founded by the same two guys who had a previous failed startup.
So even the giants have stumbled along the way?
They have, and it's reassuring to know that failure doesn't have to be a disqualifier.
It can actually be a stepping stone to something even bigger.
That's a great way to put it.
So to wrap things up, what are the biggest takeaways from Hvidkjaer's book?
I think the key message is that failure is not the opposite of success. It's a part of the journey.
It's a part of the process.
Exactly, and by studying failures, both our own and those of others, we can gain invaluable insights that help us avoid making the same mistakes.
It's like having a roadmap to success.
But instead of just highlighting the scenic route,
Good,
it
good.
also points out all the dangerous curves and potholes along the way.
That's a great analogy.
So embrace the journey, stay persistent, and never stop learning.
And remember, even if you do stumble, it's not the end of the world.
Get back up, dust yourself off, and use that experience to fuel your next venture.
That's inspiring. Well, thanks for diving deep with us into Kim Hvidkjaer's How to Fuck Up Your Startup. Hopefully you found it insightful, maybe even a little bit inspiring. Until next time, keep exploring, keep learning, and keep diving deep.